All right, so let's say the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. All right, so we're going to get into what will, I'm sure, be very familiar territory for all, if most, if not for all of you. So we're going to zip through the end of the 10 Commandments here. But I want to come, once we do that, I'm going to see if we can't create some understanding, some linkages to the rest of the commandments. So if somebody would take on the responsibility of reading verse 12 in Exodus, which corresponds to verse 16 in Deuteronomy, and so forth down the page, that would be great.
I haven't for a while, I guess. All right. Honor your father and your mother, that you may long endure in the land that the Lord your God is assigning you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male or female slave, nor his ox or his ass, or anything that is your neighbor's. All right, so that's Exodus.
That's Exodus, and the same section in Deuteronomy.
All right. Honor your father and mother as the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may long endure and that you may fare well in the land that the Lord your God is assigning you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not crave your neighbor's house or his field or his male or female slave or his ox or his ass or anything that is your neighbor's.
Okay, so there are a couple of things that are worthy of comment here. I mean, it's all worthy of comment, but in particular, in terms of our context, what do you think is the difference between covet and crave?
Oh, wow.
Why does that get changed, do you think?
But they're both covet for
Yeah, on one level, they seem to be the same.
Oh, I see. In Deuteronomy, the first word is covet and then crave.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so why would crave be added in there? What you might think wouldn't be an unreasonable thought that they're basically synonyms, and they are. But as we all know, the Torah adds words or changes words for particular purposes. It's not accidental. So what is the reason, do you think, and we're speculating, that crave gets added as a balance or replacement for covet? What's the difference?
My feeling would be that crave is almost like an addiction.
Yeah, very strong, almost
covet is not.
Attraction.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that would be one way of looking at crave, and covet, on the other hand, would be what?
Covet is like desiring someone wrongfully, desiring. There is an intent of that is not right.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable possibility. I think covet is might even be a little bit stronger, in the sense that when you say that you covet something, I think you're willing to go further to try to get it, whatever the it is, than if you just say, I like this, or even that I want this. Yes, Stan.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to President or ex-president Jimmy Carter, and he had talked about craving in his heart and considering that a sin. But he could control it, and he could feel remorse for it. And on craving, I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Yeah, craving, I agree. Craving seems to be a little bit stronger. When you crave something, I mean, the association I have, for what it's worth, is that it is, if it's governable in a much more tenuous sense than other things. You only barely can resist it. You know?
Right.
It says covet is possessing, where craving is more an instinctual desire.
Right.
I think a lot of people would agree with that. And that is another possibility. Yeah, Remy?
I'm also thinking what Stan, I remember Jimmy Carter saying that when you look at a woman and you are, even you don't fulfill, you are lasting after the woman, and he considers it a sin. And I think if you look at a lot of the verses in the Old Testament, I think he has a point there. Of course, you can last, but you don't fulfill, you don't carry it to the point you want that physical, you don't desire her physically. So you have a point, Stan, but maybe Rabbi can have some insight on this.
I want to make one comment about this. This is one of those places where you see some real distinction between Christianity and Judaism. In Christianity, to lust or to covet can be just internal. It's a feeling or a desire. It does not require an action. You have committed the sin just because you have the feeling. In Judaism, feeling schmealing. You have the feeling. That's maybe it'd be better if you didn't, but the sin is in the action, not in the feeling. And this is generally true as a distinction between Judaism and Christianity.
But neither of these seem to be actions.
Now that is a very good point, and which is worth talking about. What's the context of these words of covet and crave?
Well, they're thoughts.
Well, they are thoughts, but they in the text they come in a context.
Well, covet. If you look at which one am I talking about?
Well, let's start. Let's look at verse 17. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery.
The only thing I was going to point out, Rabbi, is Deuteronomy adds on covet your neighbor's field, which is not in
also true. Yes.
Exodus.
Yeah, but the murder thing those are all actions.
They are all actions, and not only are they actions, but where and how do they get determined? How do you know that somebody has committed murder, let's say?
Well, through evidence and then through some kind of trial.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it refers to a legal proceeding. There is a trial, and you're convicted of the behavior at the trial. There is testimony, there is evidence, and so on and so forth. Okay. But with coveting, there's no, or craving for that matter, nothing analogous. There's no legal proceeding. There's no evidence because it's all internal.
Right.
So there is a distinction here. This is about coveting and craving is about a feeling, rather than necessarily a behavior. Because once you're talking about behavior, now you're into something else. You're into adultery, let's say. But to feel even an overwhelming, even a powerful emotion about wanting to have or to be connected with something or someone else is quite a different story than actually taking action. If you say, you shall not murder, there's no emotional content there. The Torah doesn't care why you murder or how you felt that led you to murder. It doesn't matter. Murder is a problem no matter how you felt about it. You might have some ungovernable emotion, revenge or hate or whatever it is that motivates you, but that's not a consideration, not even mentioned. Committing adultery even. You would think if anything would be about emotion, you would say adultery is about emotion, but it's not. It is a behavior that is a problem. Why? Because you have made a vow. And because you have made a vow, and back in those days, much more sad to say than in our own days, a vow was sacred. It was a serious business. You didn't just make a vow. It was a serious thing to make a vow. And for that reason, it becomes a problem. It doesn't matter why you break the vow. You had a bad day. You didn't like this person. You wanted to get back at them for something. Any and all possibilities are things you could contemplate, but breaking the vow, the marriage vow, is a problem no matter why you do it. So it's not even mentioned, it doesn't even come into play.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Adultery. Okay, at least one of the partners has to be married for it to be adultery. That's right.
that's
Okay.
right.
No, I was just wondering, what about two non-married? Well, there's no broken vow. Okay,
Well, no, that would not be adultery
right.
if they're not married. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Stealing, same thing. You might really want something, might even be a passion, but it doesn't matter. You steal, it's wrong, end of story. So you've got a group of unarguable sinful behaviors that are, for which emotional content is not relevant. And then you move to coveting or craving, which is an internal, if you want to call it an act, you can, but it is internal, and it is about feeling. It is about
that goes against what you were saying about Jews don't care about what goes on in the mind. It's about action. But here it's the opposite.
Yeah, so let's take a look at it.
But I want to, okay, we could do that. But I also am curious about, we always think about how do we tell kids that they should or shouldn't do something? And
Yeah.
it's somewhat arbitrary, maybe that's a bad word, to say you should not do it because God tells you not to do it, as opposed to it's bad for community, or it's
Well, all these things are relevant.
okay.
God tells you not to do it. There may also be other considerations as well. But
Okay, we can go to that's fine, but we can go to the idea that these are mental things, and how does that interfere with?
That's what I want to get at.
Okay,
You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not crave your neighbor's house or his field or his male or female slave or his ox or his ass or anything that is your neighbor's. What is this coveting or craving about?
Internal.
Rabbi,
Sorry?
Rabbi, I have a comment or a question regarding your question
Okay.
about coveting. Coveting. A few minutes ago, you said there's a difference between the Christian way of thinking and the Judaism thinking. That in Judaism, until you do the behavior, that's the sin. Whereas in the Christian way, you can think and still sin without carrying
Yeah, the thought itself can be sinful. Yeah.
Yes, but in this context here, that God gives this instruction in Deuteronomy as well as in Exodus, it's almost like God doesn't even want to think those things, even they are not manifested for people to see it.
Well, that's what I am just about to want to talk about. What does it mean to say that you covet something or someone? And by the way, it could be something and not just someone. You can covet an object as well as a person. What is the point of saying you're not allowed to covet your neighbor's house or field or male or female slave or ox or ass, anything that is your neighbor's? What are we talking about? Coveting what?
The way I look at this, Rabbi, when you covet things or the other person, to me, when you are desiring something that is not right, and it will take over your psyche, that's negative. It's almost you're creating an inner environment that will focus you outside of God, and it's not good for you, and it's not good for the people around you. I think that's the reason why God gives this instruction. It's just a good, those things not to do them, because they will, what's the right word in English? They will affect your thought process. Before you can deliver things, it has to go in the command center of our brain, and we cannot allow garbage or stuff.
I think you're right. I would agree with everything that you're saying, Remy, except that there is an oddity here. This is like that. I don't know if you guys are the right generation to have kids who watch Sesame Street, but if you watch Sesame Street, they used to have something on regularly. You know, which of these things is not like the others? Okay. Now, in this list, there is something which is not like the others. Which is it?
Well, the first two are physical things, and the very last one is physical or not, but the middle ones are all live beings, human and non.
I'm not sure I followed you exactly, Stan.
You're
looking at
house, field are physical things.
They are.
Male or female, slave or ox or ass are all living beings, not necessarily
but
human.
they're all things that you own.
Right.
Every one of those things is something that you own, except when you're dealing with your
the wife. The wife
is not something you own.
Maybe in their context, the wife was a possession, but it's not considered a possession today.
It's certainly not considered a possession today. Anybody who is married in the 21st century knows very well that your spouse is not something that you own. But
right. Well, even the courts,
even back in the days of the Torah,
the courts
had legal rights.
Right, and even the courts recognize, at least in the United States, I think, that there can be rape in marriage.
That's true.
So
what I'm saying is that applying the word covet or crave to this entire list is what I want to say, leads us to ask the question, how is it that your neighbor's wife is included in a list of objects or or even people that you own. How does the wife make that list? You would think that there would be something different in that relationship to your spouse that would put them in a different category than your field or your slave or whatever, all things that, or even people that you own. How does the wife get put in that list?
It may have been the culture at the time, Rabbi, where the spouse was considered property. I mean, after all, there was a dowry, and the husband or the wife has to pay, or the family has to. So maybe they were considered possessions in those days.
In some regards, on some points of view, yes. But even so, within those considerations, dowries, et cetera, the wife has certain rights. So, for example, even if the husband who had control wanted to have a divorce, he had to observe the conditions of what was called the Tanaim, between really conditions of the betrothal, and owed some things to the wife because of their financial relationship. So it's not entirely ownership. There is a sense in which, to some degree, we would say today, it was unfair. But in that context, it was rather remarkable that in Jewish marriage, the wife did have rights, legal rights, that had to be observed by the husband, even in the case of divorce. Yes, Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, were those Torah laws dealing with the husband and wife, or are those rabbinical sins? I mean,
Well,
you
they're
think
both.
about a
They're
get or
both.
something like that.
The document,
The ketubah?
Ketubah, goes all the way back to the Torah.
Okay.
So, yeah. So, what I'm getting at here is this is a little bit of a mixture, which leads us to the conclusion that covet or crave adds some element of meaning that puts all of this list in a different category. The question I'm posing is, what's the category? How do we identify the way in which this list of things which each has some affinity or some relationship to the other, what is it that's added that creates a different category? If we're talking about coveting or craving, how is that the same or different from coveting a field or a farm animal? How are they in the same category? Doesn't that strike you as odd? Does me. Though they're in the same category, why? What would be the grounds for saying that they're in the same category?
Well, coveting is a sinful desire in the heart for anything that rightfully we shouldn't have.
Okay, that's a definition of coveting. How does that apply to all the things in this list?
Because we
You still
shouldn't have
the
them.
problem that the wife is not exactly in that list. So, all right. So how does coveting apply to the wife? It does, you're right.
I think
In a sense, you shouldn't covet your own wife, in terms of wanting to own.
Well, that's a very 21st century interpretation.
So I want to say one more thing. So in Buddhism, we have an idea of sympathetic joy. And it's kind of the other side of this, which is really nice, which is feeling joy for someone else's good fortune.
Right, which is the sort of the opposite of Schadenfreude.
I don't know that word.
It's a German word, we use it in English too. It means to take pleasure in someone else's pain or failure. And we rejoice at their downfall. Okay, so Schadenfreude would be kind of the opposite. What is there a Buddhist term for what you just were talking about, Kim?
I don't know.
Well, if you ever find out, let me know. I
Okay.
would love to know what that is. Okay, so insofar as the wife, the spouse, is not exactly a thing, although there is, in some sense, a relationship of ownership in a limited way. What is it that covet or crave refers to? What's the sin?
Well, in
Very, very helpfully read us a definition of covet. It was very, very helpful. What is the sin in that?
Well, of course, you've got the example later in the Bible of David and Bathsheba. He
Yes.
certainly coveted, but he followed through. And by both Christian and Jewish definitions, that's
Well, what was David's sin?
committing adultery, and also
That's
being
not what anybody remarks on.
To desire wrongfully?
No. He
also was an
Bathsheba's
accomplice.
husband, Uriah,
Wasn't
to
he
the
also
front
an
lines in
accomplice?
the battle so that he's going to get killed.
Yeah, that way. Yeah, he was an accomplice to murder. Or
Yeah, well, yeah, he was an accomplice. I didn't say you'd say accomplice. I mean, he was instrumental in creating the death of Uriah so that he could have Uriah's wife. Okay, now this is a very good example, Stan. When you're
Rabbi,
involved with coveting or craving, the implication is that you will do things to acquire the item or the person, whatever, that go beyond just the emotion. There is an action that's inherited. If you
Is-
covet something, what might the action be? You covet.
Is
Yeah.
that being tempted? Tempting? It's almost like the instruction, don't tempt yourself to covet, because once you start that is a slippery slope.
Yeah, there are many possible examples, but let's say you borrow your neighbor's lawnmower. You don't have a lawnmower. Your neighbor has a lawnmower, and you say, I'd love to borrow your lawnmower, which you do, but then you don't return it. Okay? That comes out of the fact that you covet your neighbor's lawnmower. There is an action, and the action is not returning the lawnmower. Okay? It's not just the emotion of wanting the lawnmower. There is something that you do, or in that case, that you don't do. Your behavior is altered in some way because of this emotion of coveting.
It starts off a cycle, like a domino effect.
How
so?
so?
Well, we have, like in Buddhism, we have right view and right action. So that these are views, but they lead to actions.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. The action might be subtle. It might not be on the same level as stealing or murdering or whatever. Those are pretty clear and pretty terrible. But there are smaller, more nuanced actions that come out of coveting.
Well, it could be stealing or adultery.
Well, but they can even be smaller. Like, for instance, You borrow your neighbor's lawnmower and you don't return it. What happens to your relationship with your neighbor?
Goes downhill.
It goes downhill. You avoid your neighbor. You see him come out, you go back in the house because you don't want to have the conversation about the lawnmower. Okay, there are ways in which your behavior is altered and his behavior is altered because there is something between you which you have not resolved.
So you've destroyed a relationship and community.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. You have a relationship with someone, you borrow something, you don't give it back, and now all of a sudden, both of you are thinking about this much of the time. You may not say anything about it, but it flavors the relationship. It is a point of infection. It changes the relationship. So what I'm getting at is that there is a class of sins here that are part of the 10 Commandments that have to do with something more subtle or more indeterminate than what we normally think of as part of the 10 Commandments. So look, murder, stealing, this is pretty clear. Nobody argues about those. But there is a classification of sin called coveting, which is much more indeterminate and which we know, if we think about it, impacts our relationships, impacts society, but which impacts it because we try to ignore it. So we have a whole list of them right here. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. How, if you really covet your neighbor's wife, that's not just a feeling. You're going to behave differently towards your neighbor's wife and your neighbor because of that feeling. It's going to change the relationship. It's going to change how you interact with each other. Same with all these other elements on the list. So what I wanted to get at is, what does it mean when the text says covet? It means that we allow our desires or our emotions to impact and distort our relationship with other people or with the society in which we live. Now, things are not the same as they used to be. They are, in a way, twisted.
So it really is about action.
It is about action, but not it's a much subtler form of action. It's
right.
About the way in which action, the action that comes out of feelings can change how we interact or how we feel about other people or things. So if you borrow your neighbor's lawnmower and you don't give it back, your neighbor is probably not going to loan you anything else.
So these seem to be corrective. The 10 Commandments seem to be corrective of a society that was going in some bad directions. That it didn't start from the beginning of Adam and Eve, but there were problems. And then, so there was a lot of experience in making these up, assuming that they didn't come, God didn't write them down.
Well, these are pretty common examples of things that might lead to exactly this kind of distortion in your relationship with other people or with your community. Now, if you are known as somebody who is can't be trusted to with other people's possessions, that changes your position in society. You're not going to get the same respect or the same treatment, if that is part of your history. So what I'm getting at here is that the text is not entirely about emotion there, but a more indeterminate or more subtle form of action, which I think goes towards your point, Stan, earlier.
Oh, okay. Well, and that was also what Remy had said in terms of the slippery
Yes.
slope.
Yes,
So,
you're right.
um,
You're absolutely right. So, all right, let's take a look.
oh, one more thing.
Yes,
This is more for Kim because he's mentioning Buddhism. In Amarillo, we had an adult education thing on Sunday mornings. And one of the books we studied was this one, The Jew
Yeah,
in the
I have it
Lotus.
right up there. Yeah.
All right, I just wanted to let you know that I had that with the intersection of Judaism and Buddhism.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what's the name of the book?
The Jew and the Lotus.
Oh, yeah, Roger Kamenetz. Yeah, you know where that title comes from, right?
No.
Okay, so it's a pun. There's the expression,
Well, I know about lotus. There's a lotus is
there's
very
a
beautiful.
jewel in the lotus.
There's
Jewel,
right. Well, the lotus comes out of muddy water. We use that image a lot.
right. But Roger Kamenetz accompanied a
Oh,
bunch of very famous rabbis who were being consulted by the Dalai Lama, because the Dalai Lama wanted to learn how, from the Jewish experience, how to maintain the belief system, the customs and so forth of Buddhism in exile. Okay, and he figured there's nobody in the world who knows better how to do that or has more experience in trying to do that than the Jews. So he invited a bunch of very eminent rabbis to come and consult with him. And Roger Kamenetz, who's not a rabbi, but a reporter, went along as somebody to write about this this meeting between the Dalai Lama and these rabbis, some of whom I know. Like Yitz Greenberg went, there was a few, some very eminent guys. So when he wrote about it, he got a great title, absolutely great title, because Roger Kamenetz was the Jew in the lotus. Well, you following me?
Yeah.
It's just a clever title for a book. It's a great title for a book. But that's where it comes from. Okay.
I'll put the reference for Remy and Kirby in chat in case they're interested.
It's a great story. Kamenetz.
Thank you. I want to, it's a good book. I want to get the book. I'll read
Oh,
it.
it's a very good book. It's a very good
Okay.
book.
Okay, I'll get it. Thank you, Kim.
Yeah, it's very much a worthwhile book, and you can download it. It's on online. So
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Thank you.
sure. All right. So now we have finished the 10 Commandments, so to speak, in and of themselves as comparison. Does anybody happen to know, have you ever come across the expression, the name that is given to these 10 Commandments? Because in Jewish sources, they're not called the 10 Commandments. That's a title that was given to it by others. And in fact, the first so-called commandment is not a commandment at all. I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage.
They're called the 10 statements, aren't they?
Yes, the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 sayings, the 10 utterances. Yeah, so, and some of them are clearly not commandments exactly, the first being the best example. But they do eventually get this title of the 10 Commandments because some of them are commandments, but there's something else involved. What would be the difference, do you think, between 10 utterances or sayings on the one hand and 10 commandments on the other hand? How would you distinguish between those two? How is an utterance different from a commandment?
Commandment implies the need for obedience.
It does.
The need for what? I didn't hear that word.
Obedience.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, a commandment is something that you are obligated to do. There's no question about it. Yes, an utterance, kind of neutral. Yes, Stan?
Stan,
Stan,
you're
would you
muted. Stan is muted.
Stan, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Normally hitting the space bar unmutes me. I've got a clock here that chimes, and that's why I keep it muted. But I'm thinking of statements as Pirkei Avot, or the sayings of the fathers. Those aren't
Right.
commandments necessarily. They are words of wisdom, but they are utterances, as to use your term, Rabbi, rather than actual commandments that they would like us to follow them, but they're not in a position like God is to make a demand, as Kirby said.
Well, of this list that we've just been studying, some of them clearly are commandments.
Yes,
You shall not steal. That's a commandment, right? It's not just a saying. But why would we have this word saying or utterance as a analog for commandment? What
Well,
is
as you
added or
pointed-
what is subtracted by using that word? Yes, Stan.
as you pointed out, the first one is not a commandment. And so by calling them 10 commandments, you need something broader than that. And I
Right.
guess commandments and statements would
It's 1 o'clock.
be a little cumbersome.
Yeah. Well, we've kind of come to the end of our time. So let
No,
me
we
just-
go till 1:15.
Oh, 1:15, that's right. Today's 12:15. I'm sorry. So, when God says something, what's the status of such a statement? It may or may not come in the form of a mitzvah, of a commandment. But how does that, but let's say that it doesn't come in the form of a commandment. There's no thou shalt or thou shalt not attached to it. How does that change, if it does change, the significance of what God says?
He comes first. You know, I am the Lord thy God. I mean, he has an audience, which is mankind, and he tells them, focus on me, to me.
Yeah.
First, I am the foremost. I am the number one, basically.
The rabbis have in fact looked at this list and divided it into two parts. The first part are 4 theological statements, you might say. The last are behavioral. I am the Lord your God. You shall not have other gods before me. These are statements of belief more than they are commandments of behavior.
But they're also about individual versus community.
Okay, how do you see that?
Well, each one of them, making yourself a sculptured image. This is, you could do this in a desert island with no one else there. I mean, or you could not do it. And then not having other gods, that's something an individual would, you don't need another person to do that or not do that.
Well, you know, that's an interesting point, Kim, because in the ancient world, religion was not a personal thing. religion was indistinguishable from the customs and traditions of a people.
Yeah, I think you've talked about how it's a new idea, maybe 300 years old or something.
Something
Rabbi,
like that. Yeah. Yes, yes, ma'am.
what you are, when you divided the four theological, and then the next one, the next group is, you call them behavioral. I'm looking at the sayings. It's
Yes.
God's relationship with mankind, and then the behavior is relationship of mankind to mankind.
Well, that's true. I wouldn't disagree with that, but I think it's also fair to say that these are what I want to say, expressions of what God wants and approves of in the last part. Yeah, Kirby.
You're muted, Kirby. You're muted.
There we go.
Yeah.
To follow up with what you just said, Rabbi, that these 10 words, so to speak, of instruction were to function in part as part of a covenant
Yes.
that God was establishing. And when you establish a covenant, that's law. So he's wanting you to follow this.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And to add to the point, there is a form that is being followed here. It has to do with what's called a vassal treaty. In the ancient world, the ruler, the king, whatever, would make a treaty or a covenant or a compact with his subjects. And there were certain features of how this was expressed. The first thing that would be a part of such a treaty was the identification of the king. Who is the king? How do you know who it is you're talking to? And it would be like, I am King George III. I am the king of all the British Isles and the entire British Empire around the world, upon which the sun never sets. I mean, you have sometimes very grandiose explanations of who it is that is making this covenant. But it was a way of identifying the source of authority behind the covenant. Who is it that we are in relationship to? Who does the vassal have a relationship with? And that would be identified first in the treaty. And then there would be terms of the treaty. You shall do this, you shall not do that, and so on and so forth. You'd have a whole list. So this follows the outline of the ancient form of treaties between monarchs and vassals. This happens, by the way, not just in the Torah, or not even just in ancient documents. For example, I love these little highlights and sidelights. Think about the beginning of the Constitution of the United States.
We the
You
people.
get a different view of how revolutionary it was. How does this document start off?
We the people, in order to create a more perfect union.
Right. So normally that's where the description of the monarch would be. It's replaced by the authority of the people. That was exactly the revolutionary nature of the creation of the United States. The people themselves were the authority. There's no king, there's no God, there's no higher authority of any kind. The people themselves constitute the authority for this treaty, this agreement of what we shall do or what we shall not do.
And you could say, I mean, I would say that a lot of the friction we're seeing now in our country is a disagreement about that, where some
I would
people think
agree.
the people are the authority and other people think the government is the authority. And
The government doesn't come into it. The government would not be the authority.
well, the government being like the capital and the people who,
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, I'd go with that. I mean, there is this notion, and it is present in the Constitution, that there is an authority that we might call natural law, which undergirds these documents. The way the republic is outlined has to do with the authority of God in natural law. So it's not entirely cut and dried, but normally we would start off such a document by saying, in one way or another, God has ordained that there should be self-government, that
And-
people should be in charge.
And Moses started that way. He says, Moses summoned all Israel and said, "Hear, Israel, the decrees and laws I declare in your hearing today. Learn them and be sure to follow them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb."
Yeah, that's a very good example. It's a good point. Here we're talking about a theological document. So yes, it makes perfect sense that behind whatever authority might be listed, ultimately it's God's authority, which supports all this. And that's, it might or might not be entirely obvious. It might or might not be obscured, depending upon the language, but one can reasonably assume that God's authority undergirds these statements. And that's why the Aseret Dibrot, the 10 utterances, are sometimes called the 10 Commandments, because it's God's authority that ultimately supports them.
But I like yours and Stan's point about the Constitution or the Declaration. We the people. It starts with that. It's supposed to be that. As Kim pointed out, we're differing from that today. But here in the Bible, the Lord starts out, and there's the source of that's the authority.
Yeah, I think apropos of Kim's point, Kirby, I think what we're arguing about is who gets to decide who is included in this expression, we the people. We are arguing. So
People are arguing today about God. Do we really need to follow God?
well, that's true. But in terms of the document itself, if you look at a certain group of folks, whether they are a certain ethnic or religious group, or whether they're immigrants or whatever they may be, we are arguing about who gets to be included, and therefore who gets to interpret what the document says. Yeah, Stan.
Yeah, well, at the time it was written, it was the wealthy, the landowners, and that because that's what the limit to voting was.
and it was also males, white
Right,
males.
males also. And it obviously got extended legally through the 19th Amendment. No, is it 19th that gave women the right to vote?
The 20.
I don't, whatever, but I mean,
Yeah, I'm not
that
sure.
was the last extension. There was a huge one following the Civil War in what,
Right.
14 or 15.
But they didn't want, they only wanted white women to vote.
Right. Right.
Well,
I had another comment on Kirby's. Let me see if I can recap. Oh, Kirby, you're right. It's God commanding. On the other hand, this is a covenant, which means an agreement between the two. and that is the people had to accept on their part, just like a contract. And of course, there's, what is it, a saying in Judaism, yeah, they had the right to say yes or no, but God's holding Mount Sinai over their heads, so you better do it the right way.
Yes, you can decide whatever you want. But you know, the midrash that you're referring to, Stan, is even more explicit than maybe you remember, because God says, holds Mount Sinai over their heads, says, you can accept this Torah, or here will be your grave. Okay, so it's pretty unambiguous. But you have to remember that God had already, according to the Midrash, gone around to all the different peoples in the world, each one of which had rejected the Torah. So God was down to its last choice.
And so he was getting frustrated.
Well, there was nowhere else to go. He couldn't ask the animals, because
Well, you end up giving people a choice when you don't.
You have thinking ability in order to be part of a covenant. You know, so it's actually a pretty fascinating story. One point or other, maybe we'll decide to study this question of the giving of the Torah as it is expressed, not just in the biblical text, but in the rabbinic literature. I mean, there is a huge amount of, maybe we should do this, because we're at the end of the Ten Commandments, and we could study the text as it recounts how the Torah was given. What are the details of the process? Pretty interesting stuff. Maybe we'll do that. In any event, I think it's fair to say, by way of summary, that we've discovered some interesting differences between these two texts, and that leads to a question that we're not going to resolve right now, but I want to leave as a seed for your thought. And that is, this is not the only case where there is a textual difference between one part of the Torah and another part of the Torah. We haven't even covered the third formulation of the Ten Commandments, where honoring your father and your mother is not how it's said. It said honoring your mother and your father, mother coming first, out of which the rabbis make a whole deal about the equality of mothers and fathers and men and women and so on and so forth. So I mean, there's a lot of stuff to uncover here. And the seed I want to leave with you is something that I think we've been sort of dancing around for a while, which is, how do we account for the fact that not everything in the Torah agrees with everything else that's in the Torah? There are parts that are in opposition to each other, and it's pretty clear that that's so. How can that possibly be? You would think that if God gives the Torah, everything would be consistent. How could there be inconsistencies in the text? Now, you can either say, all right, it's a human document, and there are mistakes and so forth, but that's a very uninteresting answer. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's uninteresting. It's much more interesting to ponder the question, how can it be intended? What is the meaning? What is the purpose of these inconsistencies? Why are they in the text, and why are they preserved in the text?
That's our assignment, right, Rabbi?
That's right. To think about that question is your homework assignment. Normally, I don't give homework assignments, but that's your homework assignment for this week, while I think about what we're going to go on to next week. I think it might be the text of the giving of the Torah. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming, as per usual.
Thank you,
And,
sir.
see
Thank
you
you,
next
sir,
week.
for leading us.